The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the condition of indigenous peoples around the world, James Anaya, briefed journalists at the United Nations October 19. He pointed out that while most countries recognize indigenous rights, they do not know how to implement them.
There is an enormous gap between the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights and the realization of those rights in the everyday lives of indigenous peoples. And that gap needs to be narrowed, obviously.
Discussing the situation between indigenous peoples and multinational companies, the Special Rapporteur said all over the world there was a disconnect between the parts of government that addressed indigenous peoples' rights and the parts that promoted natural resource development. Anaya said a lot had to do with coordinating those two policies.
In a disconnect, I mean those parts of government often simply don't coordinate with each other. So we see two, in many ways, opposing the policy objectives being pursued. One, promotion of indigenous people's rights, and the other, extraction of natural resources. So a lot of the work has to do with simply coordinating those two policy regimes and initiatives on the part of governments.
He stressed that the challenges were significant because of problems that were systemic, including patterns of violations that dated back centuries. Those patterns, he said, were hard to reverse.
And those patterns are hard to reverse. But little by little, I think we're seeing movement towards that reversal.
Commenting on climate change and its effects on indigenous communities, Anaya said it was indigenous peoples that were suffering most from the effects of climate change, including indigenous peoples in the Arctic and in small island nations. TITV Weekly.